Hello, welcome back to the Wannabe Guru podcast. Today we're going to be talking about rising above. It's going to be a two-part mini-series of growing, accepting, and then finding forgiveness in different experiences that have to do with tragedy. But before we get into that, I definitely want to explain that tragedy to each person is uniquely their experience. Doesn't matter if it's stubbing their toe or losing somebody. If somebody hasn't experienced something major in their life, then they have not dealt with different levels of what it means to experience these things. So I know that maybe even some of you out there can look at some of my stories and even maybe the story I'll share today as being insignificant to yours. But I want to put it out there that, everybody's completely different and you have to find the value and understand the tools that I'm going to express today so that you can use those to overcome tragedy, because obviously there's a lot happening right now. Everybody's experiencing it, I think, on an energetic level. Whether you see it on TV or you feel it like I do with people's face expressions walking down the street and the hardship that a lot of people are going through right now, even in where I live, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, California, San Diego. And a lot of you might be asking, well, what have I experienced, or what does tragedy mean to a white male living in such a wonderful place? And I would have to say that everybody experiences something different, and I've experienced my share of tragedy in my life, and I've grown up with a lot of it. I grew up in a very abusive family, and that's kind of one of my stories today, is telling you some of my experiences that I had in the past couple of years. And after I share my experience, then we can kind of review how I was able to overcome that tragedy and rising above and facing my fears. And so thank you so much for listening, and let's jump into it. So before getting right to the main points of the story, I definitely want to preface some things. My parents were very young when they had me, and growing up, neither one of my parents came from the most stable of family backgrounds. Neither one of them grew up from families with very much money. And they both understood many different struggles within their family units of people dying in early ages, or both my parents died at a very early age. And so I think that they didn't get to absorb all the necessary components of being a parent. So there's a lot of course, understanding in that, but at the same time, I think that both of them were very successful in different ways in being the parents that they strive to be. And so growing up, my mother and father had a very early relationship, 19, and getting married in their early 20s and having me. So in a lot of ways, I felt like they were kids. I mean, when I was that young, I felt like a kid, and I'm so glad that I waited until I developed my relationship with my partner at a much later age than that, and then also having my first child. So there's definitely some understanding and acceptance with that. Growing up, they both were trying to figure a lot of different things out. in San Diego, California. And so my father was a security guard. My mom, sold shoes. And they obviously didn't make very much money, but they made enough to suffice and living where they lived at that time, which was the early 80s, which was a completely different world back then as far as living down here. And so I think, well, on top of that, I think I've mentioned this in another podcast, but my dad was also a pretty heavy drug user. And when I say drugs, these days, a lot of people want to define what that is. And these were hard drugs. So that's like cocaine and heroin and speed. And my dad was a frequent drug user. And I think that on top of that, he also was chemically imbalanced. So I think with a combination of those things and depression and our hard upbringing, I think that's a cocktail of confusion for anybody if they don't try and sort those things out. And so growing up, I can remember from a very early age, things were tough for my parents, even in some place like San Diego. But around 10 years old, my mother said that there was kind of like a switch that went off in my dad's head. And he decided that he wanted to really get after it. And he did. And our lives changed pretty drastically. And he started progressing in his status as far as his jobs. And then eventually he started buying and flipping homes, working on all kinds of projects. And some of my earliest, fondest memories of my father was actually working on different projects with him. I always looked up to my dad because at that age, your dad's kind of like your hero, or he can be. And for me, that was the case. So I saw my dad building all kinds of stuff. I'd help my dad do anything from drywall to building a deck and installing patio doors and you name it, he could do it. And I was always so impressed, even from, an early age of 11 years old. I'd watch my dad do something and I'd always stand back in awe in the fact that he could just do it himself. And, he just seemed to know how to do it, even though he didn't have really a background in all that stuff. And, back in those days, there wasn't some necessarily like a book or tutorial or YouTube. You can just flip on the screen and watch something to be able to do something like that. So I was always very impressed. And to this day, I look back and I was like, man, those were some of the fondest memories that I've had, being able to work with my dad and just not talk. That was something that, for a majority of my life, it was one of those things that my dad and I could never really have good conversation unless it involved work, discussing work, and kind of game planning for certain things in our life. But when it was small talk or talking about anything about history or life, it didn't really exist. So in all reality, my dad and I never really talked very much. And so looking back, I definitely wish that could have happened more. But at the same time, we had those moments together where we didn't talk and we were just doing our thing. And I hold those moments dear to my heart. So from that point, my parents were able to invest in multiple homes and they started growing. And eventually they bought multiple properties on the beach in San Diego, Pacific Beach to be exact. And so they started, taking in more money and started defining their success. At that point, my dad also started getting into the hotel industry, in became a family thing for all of us. which was kind of really exciting for both my parents because it enabled myself and my sister to start integrating our understanding of money and business and how to develop yourself so that you can progress in the world and define yourself as thus. And I think it was a good opportunity for both of us to see what you could make of yourself, considering both of my parents didn't really have much of an education and were able to work their way up the ladder to achieve some of the things that they did, which were pretty impressive. And a lot of it came from hard work. That's one thing I can look back and definitely say that, both my parents worked their ass off, and I would see them building and painting and just eventually came down to like summer rentals and renting out different units and all the things that it took to do something like that. And it was just constant work, just when people say like, oh, how do you achieve those things from nothing? It's a shit ton of work, and I got to experience that. And I'm so proud to be able to live those moments with both my parents where I got to see them wake up every day and go to work and do what they needed to, and then come home and then go to work. And then on the weekends, there would be, resurfacing floors or painting or fixing the roof or learning how to do shit all the time. And I was always just kind of taken back that, though they always didn't have the best relationship, they worked together and were able to manage those things and grow and progress. And so as I got older, I'm guessing like 13, 14, I got to understand that like my parents' relationship was extremely volatile and that they didn't have a good relationship whatsoever. They'd have their good moments here and there, but I came to find that, my dad was a drug user and that just absolute narcissist and had explode disorder and all kinds of issues. I used to think he was bipolar for the longest time because he would flip so easily from, happy to sad to mad to crazy to absolute like acting like a lunatic. And I just realized, not right this second, but I realized it from a very early age that, my dad had, extreme mental issues. And so in doing so, I felt like I grew up really fast. I felt like, by the time I was like 13, 14 years old, I was already so influenced by so much negativity and so many different things coming my way all the time. It made me grow up very quickly because I got to understand the dynamic of both my parents and who they were, and growing up in a very abusive household. And I got to see my dad being extremely abusive and violent to my mom, where, child protective services and all that kind of stuff were knocking on our door all the time. And, it was rough having to deal with that aspect of being a kid and having to like not answer the door because you knew who was there, trying to take you away. But something my dad, always used to do, even from an early age, he would just fuck with me all the time. And I think, some people will always say like, like the more physical abusive side of things. Like my dad was also those things, mind you, not as much as maybe some other people that I knew growing up. I mean, my dad hit me here and there, and I can tell you some other bad experiences with that, but more importantly, like I came to understand that my dad was just mentally morbid when it came to how he treated me. And I don't know why he did these things, but he'd always like fuck with me in different ways. Like when I came home from school, he would tell me like, oh, I left the door open that day, and that because I did that, everything was stolen from the house and the police were there. and then he wrote up a police report, and all the shit was stolen out of my room, and I couldn't go in the house yet because they were still trying to figure stuff out. And he was serious about this stuff, like absolutely, like, role played this stuff out to me. And so, this would happen frequently. And mind you, for the first 10 times, I was extremely affected by it because he'd pull all kinds of crazy stuff. Like he would tell me that, oh, my uncle who, lived close to us, got drunk and he accidentally drove through the garage and he drove into my room and everything was fucking destroyed, and just all kinds of random stuff like that. So, my dad would toy with my mind all the time. And I think that looking back, I would have much rather been beaten, to a pulp sometimes, rather than have those kind of manipulative instances, different encounters in my life. And even when I was a child, I knew that they were wrong, but it took me a long time of educating myself, through psychology and child psych, that I was able to understand and process the depth of which those things messed me up. And so, that being said, as I got older, I got to see also how my parents interacted, and also things that I did and didn't know that were happening that I got to understand later on in my life. But just that, he was a terrible father, and the way he treated both my sister and I and my mother were absolutely horrendous. And it wasn't always, excuse me, the beatings or different things like that. I think that more so it was like the manipulative, psychological shit that he did to all of us that really affected me, and still to this day I'm affected. And I've worked a lot of those things out, but I've come to understand that I have CPTSD, and there's a lot of things that even to this day trigger me, and I'll have either a breakdown or a panic attack or things along those lines. But so to kind of get more into the point of the story and the tragedy, because obviously I could talk about all these different things for a long time. My parents became really successful at the latter part of my 20s, and they became multi-millionaires in buying houses and property and renting it out and buying shares in hotels and developing a restaurant and all these incredible things that I was intertwined with. And my father, from the very beginning would always tell me, look, the reason that you're working so hard on these things all the time, just like I did, is because one day all of this is going to be yours. And I truly believe that. So a lot of times when my friends or different times of the weekend where people would be doing things, I would be down at the properties, refurbishing stuff, painting the house inside, redoing a bathroom, what have you. Because at a certain point, and at a very early age, I think when I was like 15, 16 years old, my dad just gave up. And when I say gave up, I mean, it almost seemed like he got so burnt out, working on these properties, that he just decided not to do it anymore. And my mom and I pretty much took over. And my mom and I would work our asses off all the time. And we developed a really strong bond together in doing so, because anytime something needed to happen, it was me and my mom down there working our asses off all the time. And it was a beautiful thing. And though, sometimes you can look back and be like, shit, that was hard. At the same time, I can see that through all the crap, we built a really strong connection and a bond together in doing that kind of stuff, because we'd have a drink, we'd listen to music, and we'd work all day. And then when we got home, we felt good about what we did because we made a difference for the property and whoever was living there and getting new tenants in or what have you. So that continued on for many years after that point. And so, in doing so, I got to know my mom really well, and we developed this really keen relationship. And for whatever reason, my sister was just a different person. She wasn't into working like that. She didn't really hold the value of understanding what it takes to do something like that. And my dad would always drive me, like I said before, this is gonna be yours one of these days. And that's why, most of the time I didn't bother asking for money or wanting something out of the situation, because I always knew, I'm like, look, I'm working for all of this. This is important, not only to myself, but to the betterment of both my mom and dad, because I can tell my dad doesn't really want to do it anymore. And who else is to do it but my mom? And I'm not going to let her do that by herself. So I gained a lot from it. And I understand, I look back and I understand that I gained a lot of work ethic in what that meant, because, eventually when I started getting into my latter teens and 20s, I would have a job. And then I'd be doing the same thing as my parents. I'd be working a job, and then on the weekends I'd be going down the street, working on all these different properties and teaching myself how to do things just like my dad did. And in a lot of ways, it taught me to be proud of myself. Also, I like learning. I love learning new things, and I also love learning the value of what it takes to accomplish something. So I gained so much from that. And I look back and I feel so blessed to be put in those types of situations that when you're a teen, or even when you're in your early 20s, you look at it and you're like, fuck, this is terrible. Why am I in this situation? But really, those tools that you gain from those type of experiences are going to carry with you so far into life, that when you get older and you understand the work ethic that it takes to develop a company or a job and the value of it, you look back and you're like, man, I'm so happy that I had moments like that. So my parents developed, all these different properties and hotel, and my sister and I were kind of intertwined and all of that, but I was kind of on the forefront of helping my parents, and eventually got to the point where I almost felt like, in a weird way, like I was taking care of my parents, that they were no longer in charge of kind of doing everything that I was trying to provide for them. So at a certain point, in my at my late 20s, early 30s, I started really getting into the hotel industry with my parents. And so they had majority share of the Best Western Premier Hotel, and we're running a restaurant and all these different things, managing all these different properties. And I felt so successful because I was helping them figure out all these different things alongside of my girlfriend at that time, who is now my wife. And so at a certain point, my dad basically told me, he's like, look, like, I don't want to do this anymore. I've worked my ass off for this many years, and I've gained all these properties and hotel and restaurant, and I just don't want to do it anymore. I want to retire early, and I want to surf, and I want to do all these other things that, bring me joy. And I said, I completely understand that. So for probably 2017, 18, and most of 19, my dad was really passive as far as doing most anything as far as taking care of the hotel that he was supposed to be running and restaurant and properties. He kind of took a back seat, which I completely understand because he was telling myself and my girlfriend at the time that he wanted us to really take control for most of these things, and so we were doing so. And my days would consist of sometimes 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday through Saturday, trying to run a hotel and a restaurant, and then on the weekends trying to figure out property stuff, refurbishing things, and managing that alongside of my mom, who was mostly in control of all of that at that point. I was more on like the maintenance aspect of things, and it seemed to be functioning. So come 2019, it seemed like things were heading in the right direction. And that, for many years, my parents had seemed to not be so erratic in, their relationship. They had gone through just a roller coaster of, divorce and not divorce, and, all kinds of different events with them that I'm not going to get into. But I would say for about 3 years or so, there wasn't really many issues with either of them. Though my dad's drug use had definitely scaled up. And when I say scaled up, I mean that, in the earlier part of his 20s, he decided that prescription drugs were the way to go because, getting street drugs and doing all that were obviously too much effort. So when you have pains that he would cause himself, and he would put himself in different situations to hurt himself so that he could get more drugs. And that's what people do. I mean, they put themselves in bad situations so they can get hurt, because ultimately they know if they do injure themselves that it's readily available to go to most doctors these days, especially in San Diego, and get any type of prescription that you want. So my dad had a plethora of you name it, and his drug use just started growing and growing, and we could see that he was depressed and just overusing. And I think that it eventually got to the point where he was so erratic in his drug use that most of his day would be spent locked in his room, and then maybe he would pump himself full of opiates and then go surfing, and then straight back to his room watching TV. And I would say for 3 years that was basically his life. He would maybe spend 1 or 2 days going into the hotel to check in on it, make sure everything was copacetic, and then he would go home and do exactly what I said. And so at that point, in 2019, my wife and I had a daughter, and that we were going to be building upon one of the places that we were living. We were going to be building a second story. And so we had actually moved in with my parents for a short time to try and get that project going. And so my wife and I were basically switching off every single day at work. I would go half of the day, I'd come home, get the child, watch her, and then we'd just switch off every single day. And that was kind of our life for a good solid couple of years, working our ass off for minimal pay. I mean, at that time, I think we were getting paid maybe $20 an hour in 2019 for working excruciating hours and doing things unimaginable to make a hotel and restaurant and properties run without much help So it was a lot. Looking back, I was like, I see that I was basically a zombie. A lot of parts of the day, even for my child, being so unaware of like the emotional state that I was actually in, because I was just like this worker bee trying to function the best way that I could, micromanaging my thoughts, emotions, and energy so that I could, make everybody around me happy. And so it was tough. And so one day, 2000, or I mean, November 1st, 2019, well, actually, let's go back one day before that. My dad blew up on my mom, and this hadn't happened for many years. And so he beat her pretty severely. I think he punched her in the face like 3 times. Gave her a big black eye and, obviously hurt her. And so that hadn't happened in a while, and it was extremely shocking to me, although, things like that had happened before. And I was working, 24/7. And I tried to talk to my dad about it briefly, like right before I went to work the day before. And my dad was so out of it that he basically told me that he threw a towel at my mom and that he didn't hit her whatsoever. And so that was extremely shocking to me, because it allowed me to understand how drugged out he was, or what state he was, and so dismissive of anything that had happened. And so I kind of had to put it aside for a day to deal with it. But the next day, I get a call from my dad, and he's acting extremely erratic. And I almost don't even know a lot of the things that he's saying to me. And he throws out some statements that were just so far out there that I couldn't really understand, but he was screaming at me. And I just knew that there was something absolutely wrong. So I basically told him, like, look, I don't know what's happening, but I'm coming home. And so when I told him that, on the phone, he said, if you come home, I will grab my gun and I will kill you. And that's when I knew at that moment there was something extremely wrong happening at my house, or at my parents' house, which was kind of my house because, of course, like I said, my girlfriend at the time and my daughter were staying there. So the first thing I did was I called my girlfriend and I told her that she needed to get out of the house immediately if she was there, because something wrong was happening and I didn't know what. But I said, you need to get out of the house and you need to call the police immediately. So when I came home, and I drove home very swiftly, I think I shut down everything that I was doing, and I drove home as fast as I could. And so when I got home, pretty much I walked in the front door, and I could see that my dad was holding a knife to my mom, and my mom was quivering, in the kitchen. She was pale white. She had looked like she had been hit again. And I could see that in that moment, some of the things that went through my head was that he'd either stabbed her or he had beaten her more, or the situation was so bad that, I played out an array of different situational stuff that could have potentially happened before I got there. So I knew I had to react. And in doing so, I basically went up to my dad and charged him and tried to pacify him to get rid of the knife, and we fought. And I don't from that point on, I don't really remember all the details. I just remember that what I needed to do in that moment was more fight or flight. And what I had to do was fight, because I knew that in that moment, he was acting so erratic, and I don't know what had happened that he could have continued to attack my mom or what have you, but I had to make sure that that situation didn't continue. And so in doing so, and I came to find out this more so later, after we did fight, that I was stabbed in the stomach, and I had tried to grab, the knife out of his hand at some point, sliced my hand open, and that we had fought, and I had fallen multiple times during the event while holding the knife or trying to get it from his hand, and that we had tumbled and kind of grappled on the ground and fallen, but we had fallen a couple times where I wasn't even able to brace myself with like my other hand, so I had taken some spills. And if you've ever seriously fallen without bracing yourself, or just allow yourself to flop on the ground without stopping yourself at all, it's extremely painful and also very detrimental to your body and your spine. And I later found that out. So I was able to get the knife away from my dad, and the police eventually did arrive, and they arrested him. And I came to find out that my dad did continue to beat my mother before I got there, and he had sliced her wrist, and he had broken multiple ribs, and he had injured her pretty significantly. So I come to find out later that, he was threatening her with murdering her. And I basically stopped that. But in doing so, I was also severely injured. I came to find out that I had, and this was later on down the line, but I came to find that I had 10 herniated discs in my back, 2 extreme bulging discs in my lower back, and I suffered extreme nerve damage through my left side of my neck, through my shoulder, all the way down my arm into my fingers. I still can't feel these 2 fingers to this day very well. It used to be 3. It's now 2. But I suffered a lot of traumatic injury that day, and I think more so the injury that I suffered from all of that trauma was more so everything after that point. Because alongside of all that trauma, after experiencing that, saving my mom, I come to find that, all the legal obligations that followed that was trying to divorce, for them to separate. And that was a battle in and of itself. All right, part 2. Here we go. Okay, so from that point, I told my mom, like, look, it's finally time to move on. This is outrageous. You need to divorce this man, and you need to move on with your life, because this is absolutely horrendous. What's happened to you, what's happened to me, and I didn't even know the extent of it until months later, how much I was injured psychologically, physically, because when something like that happens to you, if you've ever been in like an extreme car accident, or maybe not super extreme, but pretty bad, like some of the things that come about are like after effects, and it takes a while till you can actually comprehend all the different things you experienced and scars that you've developed in part of the process. So try and tell my mom, like, look, you gotta divorce this man. This is how it needs to go. This is how it needs to go. So we filed, for divorce and all these different things. And in the process of this, we're talking, end of December 2019, this is when COVID really starts coming about, and people start getting really worried, what's happening. And alongside of that, my dad goes to jail for like maybe a day, bails himself out because he has the money to do so, and then goes and stays at the hotel until, we kind of sort these things out. So we're living in the house. We're all experiencing severe trauma from what happened. My mother and I are extremely messed up, both mentally and physically. And so we're trying to sort a lot of different things out, finding a divorce lawyer and this and the other. And now COVID starts kicking up. So there's a lot of worry about what's actually happening in the world with that. The news and everything else starts really lighting up, and we're hearing that people are dying and this, that, and the other. So, of course, that's always not great. Also, on top of that, all the jobs that I had regarding like the hotel, running the hotel, restaurant, properties, doesn't exist anymore. And so for the meantime, we have tenants, right? We got to take care of people. And so we can't just leave these people to the wind. And so my mother and I continue to run things as semi-normal as we can during this process. I come to find out that, my mother basically signed paperwork that's kind of like a prenup to say, she doesn't get anything. And of course, we try and fight this, but basically my dad forced her to sign this paperwork at a certain point to say that, she doesn't get anything out of the marriage. So I had to decide at that point which direction I wanted to go. And obviously, I was going to fight for my mother because she was in a bad situation. And when I say bad, I mean like, a 5-year-old child brutally beaten and gone through horrific trauma. They were dealing so much internally and what was happening with themselves. They were almost useless to deal with any situational life stuff at the moment. So I really had to take the reins and figure out a lot of different things for her as a son and as a partner to my girlfriend, and to be also there for my daughter while trying to figure out COVID and everything else. So at that point, I started vetting lawyers and trying to meet and have meetings and go. I probably went through like 8 different lawyers, some of which looked and read our situation and wanted nothing to do with it. They just thought it was a nightmare, because I would go have a meeting with somebody and they would come to understand that I didn't have much money to give to the situation. My mom had a dictionary of paperwork stipulating that she didn't have anything to give to the situation. She had no rights to any property or money. And then on top of that, we'd be fighting a white male who's extremely rich. And as a background, of all these different things he's achieved with a lot of money in the bank. So who would you side with? And that's what I ran into 95% of the time. So eventually I did find somebody to help us out. A couple different lawyers to help us fight the situation. And things seemed like they were kind of getting worked out, even though I knew from the very get-go there was very little chance of getting anywhere with this type of situation. And it was extremely difficult because, give or take, 3 months or so, I've now lost all my jobs. I don't have any money, still having to pay bills. So I'm starting to drain savings account and everything else. Still trying to take care of properties and people down the street because I felt like it was my job, and I don't feel like it was really fair to anybody to have to deal with that regardless of the situation that we were dealing with. Top of that, I'm trying to be a husband, or at that time a good boyfriend and a father to my daughter. And I knew I was extremely messed up, and I didn't know how messed up I was. But I think a couple months into it, I started realizing how messed up I was because I got another job. I basically fell back on a job that I could get because at that point, things got so wacky that everybody was wearing masks. You weren't even allowed on the beach, and we lived right next to the beach. All kinds of jobs shut down, so nobody was really hiring. And if you did, it was really awkward, weird jobs. And also, I had to find a job that I could go work and not be around a lot of people, so that I didn't potentially bring something home to my family. So I had very few options, which was also extremely difficult. So I fell back on something that, I've known for a long time, which is wrenching. I love working on cars. So I think I was on Craigslist or something like that. I saw a guy put up an ad that wanted to restore this old truck that he had. I'm talking like 1930s truck. He was a pretty well-known author. So I got a job working with him. And so it was a interesting experience, and it was great for that moment because I got to work alone. I got to go to his garage and bring my own tools and work on whatever he needed to have me work on. And it was good in certain aspects. I got to get my mind off of everything that was going on for a little bit and also make some passive income. But it wasn't until I started wrenching and doing this job that I realized how messed up I was. And when I meant messed up, I mean my back, my nerves. I'd have lightning shooting down my spine. So I spent, a good solid couple months where I'd go work this job. And every time I would go under this truck or be working on it, I would want to die. And I mean, when when people say that, it's one thing to say, it's another one to embrace. But I assure you, I would just sometimes stop as shit was falling in my face and just lie there on the ground under this truck with oil and all kinds of shit all over me. And I would just want to die. And I would just lie there in so much pain, have my nerves were all fucked up. I couldn't feel my left hand. I'd have lightning shooting down all different parts of my body. I was mentally drained. I didn't know what the fuck was going on with the world. I didn't know what was going to happen to myself or my family. And I really absolutely thought about suicide in all different ways. I assure you, when you're in moments like that, you start to get tricky. Your mind gets tricky and thinking of all different kinds of wonderful ways you can have an accident happen to you. And so I did that for like 3 months. I literally wrenched and wanted to die like every single day. So that was rough. That was another rough point for me because, you know, losing money and not knowing what was going on. And then at a certain point, for any parents out there that had to deal with COVID and school, oh my God, it was a nightmare. And I felt so privileged because my daughter went to a very well off school, Bird Rock Elementary. And even then, it was horrific. The program that they tried to develop for these kids and figuring everything out on the computer and having her sit and try and learn new tasks, and for us the parents to figure this shit out with working with programs that you felt were just put together in an hour, you know, just like a compilation of people's thoughts all thrown together in a stew that just turned out terrible. And that's what we were working with. And so as I was working all these different things out with attorneys, with COVID, with my body, losing money, trying to be supportive, it was not easy. And when I say tragedy, I mean it was a clusterfuck of a tragedy for me, trying to be the best person that I could in those moments for everybody. And it was extremely hard. And when I say hard, you can look into these eyes and see, if you could only know the depth of the hard that I had to deal with in figuring all this stuff out. And so I finally went to a chiropractor, and he did some x-rays on me I couldn't pay for it, so I had to get money through my lawyer to go do this stuff. And when I finally found out how bad off I was, it was almost extremely relieving, because for me, I got to understand the depth of like why I was feeling the way I was, which is when he looked at my spine, he's like, bro, you're fucked up. And like, how are you functioning? And I was like, well, I'm getting by, I'm drinking a lot, I am doing the best that I can to cope with these types of moments. And so he started helping me, and within just a couple weeks, I noticed a difference of my back, trying to readjust itself. But it was really hard, and the process was really hard. And in the midst of everything that was happening, my mom was just suffering immensely during the process, knowing that we had little chance of fighting anything. And the craziest part was, when all of this was happening, the court system was just going through, just the experiences of COVID and everything else that was happening. And you could tell that they absolutely wanted nothing to do with us. People were trying to figure out their lives. And then when we went to this district attorney, they looked at us and they're just like, you could just tell, they're like, we do not want to deal with this bullshit right now. We have way too much going on. And so, and I think they knew too. I mean, like, I was told many times through different lawyers, like, look, you don't have any money. You're fighting an uphill battle against a man that has lots of money, and he's already hired multiple lawyers and good lawyers to fight this, and you're in a losing battle, and basically we're not going to support you because your story is so intertwined with your family dynamic and how it functions, which was already so convoluted to begin with. When like they started, my parents told their different stories, these people were just like, God, man, this family was just so chaotic. How are they even functioning? And so for a lawyer to see that, and then during COVID and all these things happening, no one wanted to back us. So that was extremely depressing, to find out that the criminal justice system, justice isn't blind. You realize that the scale is basically, money, and that's what it comes down to. It's what it boils down to for a lot of situational experiences within the that system, the court system, and people getting tried. And I got to experience it firsthand. I got to see that, because my mother and I didn't want to or weren't able to fight somebody on that stature, they wanted nothing to do with us, and therefore they didn't back us. So fortunately, I found some lawyers that were willing to fight the good fight, even though they knew from the very beginning, and they told us, like, look, this is not a good situation. Um, you're in a really bad situation with somebody that has all the tools to fight you and win despite your story, because there's not really any proof. I mean, yeah, she was beaten severely, and you have stab wounds and all these other things that you'd think would work in your favor, right? But the saddest thing about our court system, it's all perspective. It's what you can prove. And if you get a bunch of really good lawyers to kind of twist the story and manipulate things, it's really easy to do. And I found that out firsthand. I've already known it before that. I've read a lot of stories and books to the depth of understanding of how things can get switched around and what have you to be in somebody else's favor that was absolutely at fault. But I was put in the same situation. So another tricky thing to all of this was that at one point when my mother was being beaten, she had either intentionally or unintentionally, and she doesn't really remember even to this day, that she had turned on her phone and that she had actually gotten audio and a little bit of footage of my dad actually slashing at her and slashing her wrist and throwing her into a shower and breaking her ribs. And then even audio of him basically screaming at her whether did she want him to shoot her or stab her to death. And so when they were done confronting each other, he had smashed her phone. So that was eventually recovered, I think over like 5 months of them taking her phone and extracting the information on there. And that was also proof that he had done what he had done. But yet to the court system, it was still not enough to prove what he had done to both of us. So we tried to fight the good fight. This was all during COVID, so things were moving extremely slow. I mean, I'm talking months after months or months. I mean, like 5 months went by and not really much happened. Tedious process of dealing with lawyers and everything else. And they extracted this information and still it wasn't good enough. And at which point, when it came to the 5-month marker, we started telling, some friends and family, and obviously my sister, who was kind of indirectly involved in this, basically decided to side with my dad because she knew exactly where the money was. And, if things went south with both, her parents, I was obviously taking my mom's side, and she knew, like I knew, that it was an uphill battle, and most likely, even from the very get-go, I knew that there was little of a chance of winning. But I'm a righteous person, and I knew that I was just in doing what I needed to do, in saving my mom, and also fighting for her cause, because it was just sad, and I wasn't going to let my mom just fall to the wayside in my life and suffer more than she already had. So I decided to fight for her, and I decided to put all of my being into doing so, because that's the person I am, and I would do it for my loved ones and my friends. And I'm a warrior, and I've taught myself to be that person. So I gave all of myself in that situation, and it didn't work out. I I had to sell my cars. I had to do everything in my power. Not only that, I had money that was directly tied to my father in my savings account, which also vanished. And so eventually, my father started winning court cases. And eventually, we were actually kicked out of the home that we were staying in. We actually had to move out of where we were living. And that was really hard because neither one of us, any of us, really had much money to live on. And by that time it was full blown COVID. I mean, people were acting wacky, especially in San Diego. If you guys know where San Diego is, I have experiences where, I'll tell you one experience that was pretty shocking to me. I had a terrible day, such a bad day, where I was like, I couldn't even surf, I couldn't exercise, I couldn't do anything, and I was like, I'm just gonna go sit on the beach. And I was like, I just need to go sit on the beach, and that's it. That's all I need to do. Just maybe watch the waves and try and zone out for a little bit. And I went down there, and I sit down, and this lifeguard comes over to me, and he's like, "Hey, bud." I was like, "Hey." He's like, "You all right?" I was like, "No, I'm not all right." He's like, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to get up and move on." And I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" He's like, "Rules are we're not allowed to have anybody sitting on the beach anymore. Like, you actually have to be physically moving." And I was just like, you've got to be fucking with me. I'm out in nature, in the sun, on the beach, going through hell right now. I didn't say that, and you got to get up and move. At that moment, I was just like, fucking lightning strike me down, like right now. I was like, I am done. I was like, I can't deal with any more of this. Like, I'm such a wreck. And that was that. I'll always remember that moment. You have those like pinnacle moments in your life that like define you, that you got to move on from, but you've kind of like hit rock bottom. That was like one of my many, many, many rock bottom moments. And so I had to get up and do my thing and get back to life. And so we were eventually kicked out of our place, and we had like a month or so, I think, to get out. We had to sell anything that we had to make money off of our stuff. And then I had, as the man, I had to figure out where we were gonna go to. I wasn't gonna let my family just live on the street, because there was very few options at that point as far as renting somewhere. We didn't have jobs. None of us had jobs. We didn't have any ability to really get into anywhere that we needed to. And so the fight went on. The court cases kept on going. And, as the process continued, I come to find out that a lot of my sister's friends, my dad had actually paid off under the table to write horrific stories about me, my mom, partner. I also came to find out that he had been paying rent for my deceased grandmother's boyfriend. So he basically used him, as a reference to take personal notes of who we were, character, all the different character flaws that we had, and write horrible, horrible things about all of us. One of my sister's ex-boyfriends, two of her good friends, which I'm sure she obviously knew this was happening. And I'm not talking like $100 here. I'm talking like 10 grand here, 20 grand there. I'm serious money under the table, paying all these different people to write these things. So you got to find, well, I came to find, these people that I knew, and some of them I knew pretty personally. I mean, especially, people like my step grandfather, that I never had a good relationship with. But, you think you know somebody until you run into these types of situations. Even my sister's ex-boyfriend I grew up with, didn't have a great relationship with him once again, but, these different people that she knew, my dad manipulated so heavily. And maybe not manipulated because like money's an easy tool to get people in your corner, right? And I've learned that throughout my life very well, that it's easy to manipulate people. And my dad was one of those kind of guys that happy, jolly, you know, um, put on a mask every day and he'd go out into the world and people would think he's this great, wonderful guy, and then the second he'd come home, he'd take off this mask and he'd be a completely different person. So how a lot of people recognized him was so different than the people that actually knew him. So then, I got to understand that these different people that he manipulated, um, really knew him as a different person. So it tends to happen, and I completely get it, that it does happen. And it's really sad that those people gave into that. But at the same time, like, I knew so many people that my father knew that knew him as that person. So to me, it was not too shocking that he was able to do that, because he had manipulated me into a lot of situational stuff, my mom, and other people that I knew. So it was really hard, but at the same time, we told a lot of family and friends and different people that we tried to get on our side, but in all honesty, we didn't have any money to influence them. So a lot of the family that we tried to talk to were just like vampires, and especially I could understand the situational stuff too with COVID and everything else that was happening. Nobody wanted to deal with this kind of shit. So I completely get that too. Everybody's just like, please stay away from me. I don't want your bullshit and anything that's going on right now. I know your family. I love you. Please don't talk to me again. And it was so funny to deal with friends and family, and even to this day, like, those people haven't even called me or sent me a letter or anything like that I reached out to. So I got to understand the value of friends and family and different people that you have in those close circles. And really, a lot of those people you have to test, to see if they're worth your while and in dealing with these types of situations. So that being the case, I think one of the harder ones was like my sister just deciding to basically taking sides and everything that happened. And then also learning that a lot of her friends and people on her side also decided to rise up against me and my mom because they knew that they were going to get paid for it. So eventually we had to move out. I talked somebody in to an Airbnb to basically say, like, look, COVID's happening. You're not making very many sales. Let me live here. I need my family to live here. We will respect this place. And we found a little hole in the wall to live in, all of us, for a while. And it was actually pretty decent. I look back and I was like, wow, I was very lucky to find where we're at. And so at that point, trials are happening, all kinds of things. We're trying to fight, the prenup and all these things to try and get anything, extract any money out of the situation. And it just wasn't happening. And our lawyers were pretty frank with us. With COVID and the situation, we were just told, look, it's not going to happen. And it was really sad. It was really sad for me to really learn these things, the depth of society and how everything works. And of course, I think a lot of it is influenced by everything that was happening in those moments in the world, were really reflective on what was happening in our lives. But I eventually got a job, a good job. I was able to work our way out of that situation. I was able to heal myself through exercise and getting adjusted, all these different things. And I taught myself so much through these experiences. And even to this day, like, still dealing with a lot of stuff. And this kind of stuff, of course, is only a couple of years ago. But we also